Friends, welcome back to my channel. This is Sweden, a country most people see as peaceful, neutral, and quiet on the world stage. When we think of Sweden, we usually think of calm cities, strong welfare, clean design, and a nation that stays away from wars. But behind that peaceful image is something many people don't expect. Sweden has built one of the most serious defense systems in Europe, a military designed not just to fight, but to survive against a much bigger enemy. It has advanced submarines, powerful fighter jets made at home, and a defense industry strong enough to keep supplying itself in a crisis. And here's the most surprising part. Sweden has not fought a war since 1814. That means more than 200 years of peace on a continent that has seen some of the deadliest wars in human history. So the big question is, how did Sweden become so militarily strong while avoiding war for over 2 centuries? To understand that, we have to go back to a time when Sweden was not quiet at all. In fact, Sweden was once a real European superpower. At its peak in 1658, Sweden controlled huge areas around the Baltic Sea. After the 30 Years' War, Sweden had become one of the strongest military powers in Europe. The Baltic Sea was almost like a Swedish lake, because Sweden controlled land on both sides of it. But no empire lasts forever. Sweden's power began to collapse after the Great Northern War. In 1721, a coalition led by Russia broke Sweden's dominance and took away many of its territories. Sweden still held Finland, which had been part of Sweden for hundreds of years, but even that would not last. Then came the disaster that changed Sweden forever. In 1808, Russia, under Tsar Alexander I, invaded Finland. This started the Finnish War, and Sweden was not able to stop it. 1 year later, in 1809, Sweden was forced to sign the Treaty of Frederikshamn, giving Finland and other lands to Russia. For Sweden, this was not just a military defeat, it was a national shock. Finland had been part of Sweden for over 600 years, and losing it felt like losing a part of the country's identity. The defeat was so humiliating that King Gustav IV Adolf was overthrown in a military coup and sent into exile. The message was clear. The old Sweden was finished. The country could no longer act like an empire. It had to find a new way to survive. But before we go deeper into how Sweden turned that humiliation into one of the smartest defense strategies in Europe, take a second to like this video and subscribe. More than 98% of viewers watch without subscribing, and your support helps this channel keep bringing you deep dives into military history, strategy, and technology. Sweden's next big turning point came when it got a new crown prince, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, a former general who had once served under Napoleon. Bernadotte was not just a royal figure, he was a military thinker who understood power, geography, and survival. In 1812, he made a very important deal with Russia. Sweden would accept the loss of Finland forever, and in return, Russia would support Sweden in taking Norway from Denmark. 2 years later, in 1814, Sweden fought a short campaign and forced Norway into a union. And that campaign became historic because it was the last war Sweden ever fought. After Norway was secured, Bernadotte looked at Sweden's position on the map and made a cold but realistic decision. Sweden was surrounded by much stronger powers. To the east was Russia, the same empire that had just taken Finland. To the south, Germany was slowly moving toward becoming a powerful United State. And across the seas, Britain controlled global trade and naval power. Sweden also had a much smaller population compared to these giants. So Bernadotte understood something very clearly. Sweden could no longer survive by trying to conquer others. Instead, it had to become a country that no one would find easy or worth attacking. This is where Swedish neutrality was born. But it was not some soft dream about peace. It was not weakness. It was survival strategy. Sweden's thinking was simple. If we cannot defeat the great powers in offensive wars, then we must make ourselves strong enough that attacking us becomes too costly. And for much of the 1800s, this strategy worked. Europe kept fighting, empires kept clashing, but Sweden stayed out. Instead of chasing glory, Sweden quietly focused on building its navy, expanding conscription, strengthening its defenses, and growing its industry. But the real test came in 1914, when World War I began. On August 2, 1914, Sweden declared neutrality, just 2 days before Germany invaded Belgium. But neutrality did not mean Sweden was sitting back peacefully with no fear. The Swedish Navy was quickly mobilized. Coastal forts were placed on alert. Reservists were called up to protect bridges, railways, and key points across the country. Sweden was neutral, yes, but it was armed, alert, and ready. At the time, some people inside Sweden wanted the country to join Germany, mainly because many Swedish leaders feared Russia more than anything else. But Sweden stayed out, and the reason was not just morality, it was economics. Sweden's economy depended heavily on industry, especially metal production, and that industry needed imported coal. Britain supplied much of that coal and also controlled the seas. So even if some Swedish elites liked Germany, Sweden could not afford to become Britain's enemy. Going to war against Britain would have been economic suicide. So Sweden tried to trade with both sides, and as expected, both sides became angry. Britain placed pressure on Swedish trade and created a blockade that badly hurt the economy. By 1916, food shortages became serious. By 1917, the situation was even worse. Hunger marches and food riots broke out in different towns. People were angry, hungry, and losing patience. The pressure became so intense that Sweden's conservative government collapsed, and the country had to take a more careful diplomatic position toward the Allies, just to keep food supplies coming in. So World War I was not easy for Sweden. It avoided the battlefield, but it did not escape the pain of war. The country suffered economically, politically, and socially. But the lesson was powerful. Neutrality can work, but only if you are strong enough, careful enough, and useful enough that both sides decide pulling you into war is not worth the cost. And then, after World War I ended, Sweden suddenly found itself in a safer position. Russia and Germany, the two powers Sweden feared most, were both weakened. For the first time in a long time, Sweden felt like the threat of a major war had faded. So the country dramatically reduced military spending. Many believed the age of great power wars was over. But that belief would not last long, because by the 1930s, Europe was about to change again, and Sweden's neutrality would face an even greater test. As the 1930s began, Sweden could see the danger coming. Germany was rearming fast, becoming more aggressive, and Europe was once again moving toward disaster. So Sweden made a serious decision. If Germany was preparing for war, Sweden had to prepare too. Military spending began to rise quickly. In 1936, Sweden spent around $37 million on defense. In 1937, it increased to $50 million. In 1938, it reached $59 million. But after the Munich Agreement showed just how far Germany was willing to go, Sweden's defense spending exploded in 1939 to over $300 million. The message was simple. Sweden wanted peace, but it was not going to be defenseless. When World War II officially began with Germany's invasion of Poland, Sweden immediately declared neutrality again. But this time, neutrality alone meant almost nothing. Many countries also declared neutrality: Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Finland, the Baltic states, and many others. In total, around 20 European nations tried to stay out of the war, but one by one, most of them were invaded, occupied, or forced into the conflict. And yet, out of all the Nordic countries, Sweden was the only one that remained untouched. But this was not because Sweden was safe or forgotten. In reality, Sweden was trapped between Nazi Germany on one side and the Soviet Union on the other. To survive, Sweden had to walk one of the most dangerous political tightropes in modern history. So how did Sweden survive when so many others failed? The first reason was geography. Sweden did not control the same critical choke points that Germany desperately needed. Denmark controlled access to the Baltic Sea. Norway had ports that were extremely important for shipping iron ore during winter. Sweden, on the other hand, had thick forests, long coastlines, difficult terrain, and invasion routes that would be costly and complicated. Invading Sweden would not be easy. It would take time, manpower, and resources Germany could not waste. But geography was only part of the story. The bigger reason was that Sweden made itself useful. Germany badly needed Swedish iron ore to keep its war machine running. Sweden was one of the world's major exporters of high-quality iron ore, and Germany understood something very clearly. If they invaded Sweden, those iron ore supplies could be disrupted for months, maybe even years. For Germany, a neutral Sweden that kept trading was more valuable than an occupied Sweden fighting back. In other words, Sweden survived partly because it became too useful to destroy. But survival came with difficult and uncomfortable choices. After Germany occupied Denmark and Norway in 1940, Sweden came under heavy pressure. It allowed German troops to pass through Swedish territory on their way to Norway. This became known as permit traffic. Morally, it was a painful decision, and many people still criticize it today. But from Sweden's point of view, it was about survival. The country was surrounded, outnumbered, and trying to avoid the fate of its neighbors. At the same time, Sweden was not simply helping Germany. Quietly, it was also helping the Allies and the occupied Nordic countries. Sweden shared military intelligence with the Allies. It accepted tens of thousands of refugees from Norway and Denmark. It secretly trained Norwegian and Danish police troops on Swedish soil. And when the war began turning against Germany after 1943, Sweden changed its position. It ended the German transit agreements and started allowing more support for the Allied side, including quiet access to Swedish air bases. Meanwhile, Sweden's military buildup was massive. That huge defense budget in 1939 did not stop there. By 1942, it had risen even higher. Sweden drafted around 600,000 conscripts during the war, and at peak readiness, around 300,000 men were serving at the same time. In 1939, Sweden had only 13 tanks, and only 3 of them were considered modern. By 1945, it had more than 800 tanks. Its air force also grew dramatically, from a small force into hundreds of combat-ready aircraft organized into fighter divisions. Sweden was sending a clear message. We are neutral, but we are not weak. That was Sweden's World War II strategy in one sentence. Stay out of the war, remain useful enough that great powers prefer trade over invasion, and become strong enough that attacking you would be a nightmare. It was not perfect. It was not morally clean, but it worked. Sweden survived the most destructive war in history without being invaded. Then, when World War II ended, Sweden faced a new question. NATO was formed in 1949, and Sweden's neighbors Norway and Denmark joined the Western Alliance. Many inside Sweden's military wanted to join too. Strategically, it made sense. The Soviet Union was now the main threat, and NATO offered protection. But Sweden's political leaders said no, and the reason was Finland. Finland sat directly between Sweden and the Soviet Union. In 1948, the Soviet Union forced Finland to sign the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. This made Finland a kind of buffer state. Finland could not freely join Western alliances, and its foreign policy was heavily limited by Moscow. Sweden understood that if it joined NATO, the Soviet Union might react harshly against Finland. So once again, Sweden chose a careful path. It stayed officially neutral, not because it was weak, but because it was trying to protect its own security while also avoiding a crisis for its neighbor. This difficult balance became known as Finlandization. Finland was independent, but it had to be extremely careful not to anger the Soviet Union. Sweden understood this danger very well. Its leaders believed that if Sweden joined NATO, Moscow might punish Finland by tightening control over it or even invading it. So officially, Sweden stayed neutral, partly to protect Finland. But behind closed doors, Sweden was much closer to the West than people realized. During the Cold War, Sweden secretly cooperated with the United States and Britain on intelligence. It bought American weapons, allowed NATO access in certain ways, and built its military to NATO standards. Publicly, Sweden called itself neutral, but in reality, its defense was clearly designed for one enemy, the Soviet Union. Sweden even had a secret nuclear weapons program. Starting in 1946, Swedish scientists worked on plans to build tactical nuclear warheads. At one point, Sweden came very close to becoming a nuclear power. But in the late 1960s, the program was abandoned because Sweden could not afford both nuclear weapons and its new advanced fighter jet, the Saab 37 Viggen. So Sweden chose the jet, and that choice mattered. During the Cold War, Sweden built one of the strongest air forces in the world. By 1957, it had around 1,000 modern combat aircraft, an incredible number for a country with only about 7 million people. Sweden also designed and produced its own fighters, like the Saab Tunnan, Lansen, Draken, and later the Viggen, all built to face a possible Soviet threat in the Baltic. But Sweden's strength was not only in fighter jets. It could mobilize hundreds of thousands of soldiers through conscription and produced much of its own military equipment, including aircraft, artillery, and submarines. This was the real meaning of Swedish neutrality. If you want to stay neutral, you must be strong enough to defend yourself without depending too much on anyone else. Sweden even built the whole country around the idea of total defense. Highways could be used as emergency runways. Aircraft could operate from roads and hidden bases. Fuel, weapons, and repair crews were spread out so the military could keep fighting even if major bases were destroyed. So Sweden's neutrality was never weakness, it was armed neutrality. The message was simple: we do not want war, but if you invade us, it will cost you badly. That is how Sweden stayed out of war while building one of Europe's most serious defense systems. Sweden did not just build a military, it built a nation ready for war. During the Cold War, Sweden hid military bases inside mountains and built around 64,000 civil defense shelters, enough for nearly 7 million people. Even today, these shelters must be ready within 48 hours if an emergency is declared. Sweden's defense system is based on total defense. Everyone between 16 and 70 can be called to help in wartime, whether in the military, civil defense, or by keeping essential services running. Sweden understood that survival depends on the whole society, not just soldiers. This mindset was shown in the famous booklet, If War Comes, first sent to every home in 1943 and later updated in 2018 and 2024. Its message is powerful. If Sweden is attacked, it will never surrender. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Sweden reduced its military and focused more on peacekeeping. But Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 changed everything. Sweden brought back conscription in 2017. Then, after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Swedish public opinion shifted rapidly. On May 16, 2022, Sweden applied to join NATO, ending more than 200 years of military non-alignment. In 2024, Sweden became NATO's 32nd member. Since then, Sweden has increased defense spending, strengthened its armed forces, and become one of Ukraine's strongest supporters. For over 200 years, Sweden survived through neutrality and preparation, but Ukraine proved that standing alone is no longer enough. Sweden has adapted again, not because it wants war, but because it understands the world has changed. The quiet neutral power is now inside NATO, and its message is clear. Sweden does not seek war, but it is ready for it. If you found this deep dive valuable, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about the technology, strategy, and decisions shaping modern warfare. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.